crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth around 30 to 33 CE is one of the best attested events in ancient history. Multiple early Christian sources describe Jesus' execution on a Roman cross, and several non-Christian writers, both Roman and Jewish, later refer to it. In addition, archaeological evidence, while not directly of Jesus, illuminates Roman crucifixion practices consistent with the Gospel accounts. Historians broadly agree on the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion, even as they critically examine the surrounding details. Below is a comprehensive overview of the evidence and scholarly perspectives on this event. Early Christian writings are the primary sources documenting Jesus' crucifixion. These include the New Testament narratives, the four canonical Gospels, and the letters of Paul, among others. Though written by believers with a theological aim, scholars note these texts are very close in time to the events and thus carry significant historical value when carefully interpreted. The Pauline epistles, written around AD 50 to 60, are the earliest surviving Christian texts and attest to Jesus' crucifixion as a known fact within decades of the event. Paul, writing in the 50s CE, refers repeatedly to Jesus' death on the cross. For example, he reminds the Galatians that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified, Galatians 3 verse 1, and emphasizes to the Corinthians Christ and him crucified as the core of his message, 1 Corinthians 2 verse 2. Paul's writings were penned within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death, and he had personal contact with eyewitnesses, having met with Jesus' disciple Peter and brother James around AD 36. Importantly, Paul treats Jesus' crucifixion as a well-known event. He gives no detail of the execution itself, presumably because it was common knowledge among the early Christian communities. The canonical Gospels, written from AD 70 to 100, provide detailed narratives of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. All four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written a few decades after the crucifixion, with Mark around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 90, and John around 90 to 100 CE. They draw on earlier oral and written traditions. Despite differences in perspective and detail, they consistently report that Jesus was executed by crucifixion under the authority of Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea, during the governorship of Tiberius Caesar. For example, Mark's Gospel, generally considered the earliest, describes Jesus being condemned by Pilate, scourged, and crucified at Golgotha with a sign reading, "King of the Jews," affixed to the cross. Mark 15, verses 25 to 26. The Gospels place the execution at Jerusalem on the eve of Passover, with John specifying it occurred on the day of preparation for Passover, whereas the Synoptics imply it was on Passover itself, indicating a date in the early 30s CE. From a historical standpoint, the Gospels are not unbiased reportage. They are theological narratives aiming to convey Jesus' significance. Yet historians extract valuable information by looking at points of agreement among multiple independent accounts. All four Gospels, plus the Pauline letters, affirm the crucifixion, making it a multiplier-tested event in sources that are at least partly independent. Moreover, the early Christians would have had no reason to invent a shameful death for their founder. Crucifixion was a horrific, degrading fate in the Roman world, called the extreme penalty by Romans and a stumbling block by Paul, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 23. This lends credibility under the criterion of embarrassment often used by historians. The fact that Jesus' followers preached a crucified Messiah, something foolish and scandalous to people of that time, strongly suggests the crucifixion happened in reality. The Gospel accounts therefore preserve a genuine memory of Jesus' death, even if they embed it in a framework of prophecy, fulfillment, and theological meaning. Other early Christian writings outside the New Testament also confirm the crucifixion. For instance, Ignatius of Antioch, around 107 CE, refers to Jesus Christ, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, as a real historical event in his epistles. Likewise, the late 1st century letter of 1 Clement, around 96 CE, alludes to the suffering and sacrifice of Jesus. These texts demonstrate that the next generation of Christians universally accepted that Jesus had been executed by the Roman authorities. In sum, the early Christian evidence, from Paul's authentic letters through the canonical Gospels and beyond, uniformly points to the crucifixion as a fundamental historical datum. Historians approach these sources critically, separating theological interpretation from the historical core, but find that at least the basic fact of Jesus' crucifixion by order of Pilate is very secure. Independent confirmation of Jesus' crucifixion comes from several non-Christian writers in antiquity. Although none of these authors were contemporary eyewitnesses, they had access to records or traditions and provide valuable external attestation that Jesus was indeed executed by the Romans. These sources, coming from outside the Christian community, carry weight because they are generally neutral or even hostile toward the new religion. Yet they acknowledge its founder's death. The most important non-Christian references are outlined below. Tacitus, in Annals 15.44, around 116 CE, writes that Christus, from whom the Christians got their name, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was a premier Roman historian. He despised Christians and had no Christian bias. His report of Christ's execution under Pilate in the correct time frame under Tiberius corroborates the Gospel account. Scholars consider this a highly reliable, independent confirmation of Jesus' crucifixion by the Roman state. Tacitus likely drew on official records or Roman memory, and there is no evidence of later interpolation. The tone is too disdainful to be a Christian forgery. Josephus, in his works Antiquities March 3, 18 and September 1, 20, written around 93 CE, describes Jesus as a wise teacher crucified under Pilate. In Antiquities 18, Josephus wrote that Pilate condemned Jesus to the cross, though the surviving text has been modified by Christian copyists. In Antiquities 20, he mentions the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, noting James's execution by the Sanhedrin. Flavius Josephus, a Jew writing for Romans, provides two references to Jesus. The passage in Antiquities 18, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is controversial because later Christian editors likely added pious phrases such as calling Jesus the Messiah and reporting the resurrection. However, most modern scholars believe Josephus did originally include a neutral account of Jesus' execution under Pilate. A probable reconstruction is that Josephus noted Jesus' crucifixion and the continuation of his followers without affirming Jesus as the Messiah. Meanwhile, the Antiquities 20 reference to Jesus' brother James is unaltered and authentic, accepted by the overwhelming majority of scholars. This incidental mention firmly establishes that Jesus was a real person who had family and followers. By identifying James through Jesus, Josephus implicitly recalls Jesus' fate. By this time, Jesus had been executed, explaining why his brother's mention needed the qualifier who was called Christ. In sum, Josephus, even as edited, confirms Jesus' existence and his execution by Pilate from a Jewish perspective. Lucian of Samosata, in his work The Passing of Peregrinus, around 165 CE, mocks the Christians for worshipping the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult. He also calls Jesus that crucified sophist in another passage. Lucian was a Greek satirist with no sympathy for Christians. In ridiculing them, he inadvertently provides evidence that by the 2nd century it was well known Jesus had been crucified in Judea. Lucian's tone is scornful, calling Jesus a crucified sage or sophist, but this hostile witness corroborates the fact of the crucifixion and shows that even opponents knew the basic story of Jesus' death. It's a secondary confirmation, but valuable because of Lucian's sarcasm. Clearly, the crucifixion was an established element of the Jesus story. The Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin 43a, compiled between the 3rd and 5th century CE, preserves a Jewish tradition that on the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshu after he was accused of sorcery and leading Israel astray. Hanged in this context means being suspended, likely referring to crucifixion or hanging on a tree. As in Jewish parlance, the Talmudic reference to Yeshu is a later rabbinic reflection and is highly polemical. It portrays Jesus as a false teacher and says he was executed on Passover Eve. While the Talmud was compiled much later than the 1st century, this passage likely draws on earlier Jewish memory or response to Christian claims. It confirms that Jewish opponents did not deny Jesus' execution. Instead, they acknowledged it and tried to justify it, saying it was for sorcery or apostasy. Historically, the Talmud is not as reliable as a near-contemporary account, and some details, like the 40-day proclamation of his crimes, are dubious or symbolic. But that the text matter-of-factly notes Jesus was hanged on Passover Eve shows even Jewish tradition affirms the fact of the crucifixion, though interpreted negatively. This is essentially a hostile acknowledgement of Jesus' death by the Jewish authorities. Serapion letter to his son, written sometime after 70 CE in the 1st or 2nd century, refers to the execution of a wise king of the Jews. He compares Jesus to other philosophers who were killed unjustly. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? After that, their kingdom was taken away, he writes, linking Jesus' death to the fall of Jerusalem. Serapion was a Syrian Stoic philosopher writing to his son. His letter, likely written not long after 70 CE, uses the example of 3 wise men who were killed by their own people, the third being the Jewish wise king. While Jesus isn't named explicitly, the reference is widely understood to mean Jesus, especially since the Jewish nation's kingdom was abolished soon after, a probable allusion to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Mara's perspective is pagan, or at least non-Christian, and he praises the wisdom of this king. This is a less direct but noteworthy testimony. It shows that even outside the Roman Empire, people had heard of the Jews executing a figure of great wisdom. There are no miraculous or theological claims here, just the statement that the Jews killed their king and suffered consequences. Scholars see this as an early non-Christian reference to Jesus' crucifixion, although its value is limited by the lack of detail. It doesn't mention Pontius Pilate or the method of execution, just executing or destroying the wise king. Still, it aligns with the idea that Jesus, as a perceived leader king, was put to death, and thus corroborates that aspect of his story. Pliny the Younger, letter 10.96, written around 112 CE, does not describe the crucifixion but confirms the existence of Christians who worship Christ. Pliny writes that Christians sing hymns to Christ as to a god and adhere to his teachings, indicating their belief in Jesus' death and divinity. As a Roman governor in Bithynia, Pliny sought advice from the emperor Trajan on how to deal with Christians. In his letter, he notes that Christians worship Christ and refuse to curse him. While Pliny doesn't recount Jesus' death, the very existence of a Christian community worshipping Christ within 80 years of the crucifixion implies that Jesus had lived and been executed, since Romans knew the Christian message centered on a crucified and risen Savior. Pliny's testimony is more about early Christian practice, but it indirectly supports that Christ was a real figure who had died, since Romans were perplexed why anyone would worship a crucified man. Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, written around 120 CE, briefly mentions disturbances in Rome during Claudius's reign at the instigation of Chrestus and the punishment of Christians by Nero. This is likely a confused reference to Christ. Suetonius, a Roman historian, includes 2 notes. One, that Emperor Claudius, around 49 CE, expelled Jews from Rome due to turmoil caused by Chrestus, possibly meaning the message of Christ causing riots among Jewish factions, and another that under Nero punishments were inflicted on the Christians, a sect given to a new and mischievous superstition. Suetonius does not explicitly mention the crucifixion, but his references show that within a couple decades of Jesus' death, the impact of Christ was felt in the empire's capital. The use of Christus, likely a misspelling of Christus or Christos, suggests he knew of a founder of the sect. Although Suetonius's account is very brief and slightly muddled, it is consistent with other reports. It presumes a person, Christus, existed and had followers. As evidence, Suetonius is useful mainly for corroborating that Christians and their superstition, likely the worship of a crucified man who was thought to be divine, were known to Roman authorities by the mid-1st century. Each of the above sources reinforces the claim that Jesus' death by crucifixion was a recognized fact, even among those who did not subscribe to Christianity. Tacitus and Josephus are especially significant. Tacitus's mention is independent Roman confirmation that during Tiberius's reign, which was 14 to 37 CE, Jesus was executed by order of Pilate. The precision of Tacitus's statement naming both Pilate and Tiberius aligns perfectly with the time frame given in the Gospels. Because Tacitus was known for rigor and had access to Roman archives, historians trust this account. As one scholar put it, Tacitus's testimony is valuable in establishing that Jesus existed and was crucified, and it agrees with the Christian accounts on that basic fact. Josephus, writing even earlier, provides a Jewish perspective that again puts Jesus' death under Pilate as a notable event. Even though Christians preserved Josephus's works and likely touched up the testimonium, the core statement about the crucifixion is widely considered genuine. The preservation of the James passage, the brother of Jesus, was named James, further anchors Jesus in history and indirectly alludes to his fate. Hostile witnesses like the Talmud and Lucian add to the picture by showing that knowledge of Jesus' execution was commonplace and undisputed, even if the interpretations differed. The Talmud tries to frame it as a justified execution, which actually demonstrates that the Jewish tradition did not claim Jesus wasn't really killed. Instead, they acknowledged the execution and argued it was deserved. Lucian's sneer that Christians worship a crucified man highlights how unusual the idea was in pagan eyes, but also confirms it was an established claim by Christians of his time. In sum, the non-Christian sources spanning historical annals, satire, and religious polemic independently affirm the crucifixion of Jesus as a historical event. They provide external corroboration to the New Testament narrative. Jesus was executed by crucifixion in Judea during Pilate's governorship. This convergence of sources strengthens our confidence in the historicity of the crucifixion. As historian John Dominic Crossan of the Skeptical Jesus Seminar famously stated, that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, given that we have multiple attestations, including Josephus and Tacitus, in addition to the Christian accounts. Physical archaeology directly related to Jesus' crucifixion is understandably scarce. Wooden crosses and human remains from 2,000 years ago are rarely preserved, and Jesus' own tomb, according to the Gospels, was found empty a few days after his death. Nevertheless, archaeology has uncovered evidence that substantiates the practice of crucifixion in Roman Judea and provides context for the Gospel accounts. Key findings include human remains of crucified individuals and other artifacts that align with the crucifixion story. In 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem found the remains of a man named Yehohanan ben Hagkol in a Jewish ossuary, or bone box, dating to the 1st century CE. Astonishingly, one of his heel bones had an 11.5 centimeter iron nail driven through it, with the tip of the nail bent, still attached to a piece of wood. This is the only archaeological find of a crucifixion in Second Temple period Judea. The position of the nail indicates how he was affixed to the cross. His legs were straddling the upright beam, with a nail through each heel from the sides, rather than the traditional Christian art pose of feet frontward. Yehohanan's forearm bones did not show nail marks, suggesting his arms may have been tied to the crossbar instead of nailed, consistent with historical accounts that ropes were often used to support the body. This discovery vividly corroborates the Roman practice of crucifixion described in texts. Nails were indeed used, at least in some cases, to impale victims to the cross, confirming that being nailed to a cross was not merely metaphorical. It also demonstrates that crucified victims could receive a proper burial. After execution, Yehohanan's body was taken down and eventually placed in a rock tomb. Once the flesh decomposed, his bones, including the nailed heel, were collected in an ossuary. This aligns with the Gospel account of Jesus being removed from the cross and buried before nightfall, a practice allowed in Jewish law, Deuteronomy 21:22-23, and evidently sometimes granted by the Romans in Judea. Archaeologists believe the reason the nail was left in Yehohanan's heel is that it hit a knot in the wood and couldn't be pulled out, so the soldiers left it embedded. Normally, nails were removed from the dead body, either to be reused or due to superstition. Ancient sources note people collected crucifixion nails as amulets believed to have healing or magical properties. The Yehohanan find is therefore quite exceptional, a lucky piece of evidence that escaped those practices. It powerfully confirms that the crucifixion of Jesus took place in a milieu where this mode of execution was physically real and not a later Christian invention. It shows how a crucified body might appear and how nails were applied, lending tangible reality to the gospel narratives. Until recently, the only known crucified skeleton was Yehohanan. However, new discoveries have begun to surface. In 2017, during a rescue excavation in Fenstanton, Cambridgeshire in Britain, archaeologists uncovered a Roman-era skeleton dated 130 to 360 CE, with a nail driven through the right heel bone. This find, announced in 2021, has been called the best preserved example of a Roman crucifixion ever found. The skeleton, called skeleton 4926, had a 5-centimeter iron nail horizontally embedded in the heel. Like Yehohanan, this man appears to have been given a formal burial. He was found in a cemetery with his arms folded on his chest and a wooden board or bier beneath him. Around his body, archaeologists found 12 other nails that had been removed, perhaps nails that attached his body to the cross or the burial board. They even noted a second small indentation in the heel, suggesting an initial attempt to nail that foot failed and was repositioned. This British example confirms that the use of nails in crucifixion was not limited to the Middle East. It was an empire-wide practice for certain executions. The victim's skeleton showed signs of trauma and infection on the legs, possibly from being tied or shackled, and broken ribs consistent with severe beating. This echoes the gospel descriptions of Jesus being scourged and then too weak to carry his cross fully, requiring Simon of Cyrene's help. While this case is a century or more after Jesus, it provides further archaeological validation of how Romans carried out crucifixions. Archaeologists have also found nails in tombs that might be from crucifixions, though such claims are debated. For instance, 2 corroded nails were discovered in the tomb of the high priest Caiaphas in Jerusalem, leading to speculation they might be the nails from Jesus' crucifixion, since the New Testament implicates high priest Caiaphas in Jesus' trial. A 2020 scientific analysis found traces of human bone and wood on those nails, hinting they were used in a crucifixion. However, it's far from certain that they are connected to Jesus. Most scholars are cautious, noting that nails were commonly reused or kept as charms. These kinds of finds do, however, reinforce that crucifixion was a known reality and even left an imprint on the archaeological record, be it in bones or artifacts, albeit rarely. Another archaeological artifact is the so-called Alexamenos graffito, dating from the 2nd to 3rd century. It's a crude graffiti carved in a wall in Rome depicting a man worshipping a crucified figure with a donkey's head, apparently mocking a Christian. The Greek caption reads, "Alexamenos worships his god." This artifact, now in a Rome museum, shows how the idea of a crucified deity was ridiculed, confirming that early Christians indeed worshipped a crucified Jesus, and that this was well known enough to be parodied. While not evidence of the crucifixion per se, it's archaeological evidence of the belief in the crucifixion and how it was perceived by contemporaries, aligning with literary sources that Christians preached Christ crucified. Although not directly related to the crucifixion method, an important archaeological discovery at Caesarea Maritima in 1961 corroborated a key detail of the crucifixion accounts, the existence of Pontius Pilate and his role as prefect of Judea. The Pilate Stone is a limestone block with a Latin inscription mentioning Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, and an honor to Tiberius, dating to Pilate's term, 26 to 36 CE. This is the only contemporary record of Pilate and confirms that he was the Roman governor in Judea exactly when the Gospels say Jesus was tried and executed. The stone's discovery lends historical backbone to the crucifixion narrative. It assures us that Pilate was real, and as a Roman prefect he had authority to order crucifixions. In fact, Philo and Josephus record Pilate as having a cruel streak, including ordering executions. Thus, the archaeology and literature together paint a consistent picture of the context in which Jesus was crucified. In summary, while we do not have Jesus' cross or body as physical evidence, archaeology strongly corroborates the practice and circumstances of crucifixion in the 1st century. The crucifixion of Jesus did not happen in a vacuum. It was one of many such executions carried out by Roman authorities. The discovery of crucified skeletal remains, like Yehohanan's, proves that the Romans did nail people to crosses, and the victims could be buried, matching the New Testament scenario. These findings give us a concrete sense of how horrific crucifixion was. Victims were often nailed through the limbs, hung in agony, sometimes for days, and died from a combination of trauma, asphyxiation, and exposure. Such data underscore the historical plausibility of the Gospel accounts. As archaeologist Vasilios Tsaferis wrote after examining Yehohanan's remains, the archaeological evidence corresponded with the description of Jesus' crucifixion in the Gospels. In other words, nothing in the material record contradicts the narrative. To the contrary, it reinforces it. Nearly all modern scholars, whether Christian, atheist, or otherwise, agree that Jesus of Nazareth was truly crucified in Jerusalem in the early 1st century. In historical Jesus research, two facts enjoy almost universal assent: Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. The crucifixion is considered as sure as any historical fact can be, supported by multiple lines of evidence. Prominent historians across the spectrum affirm this. For example, the late agnostic New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann wrote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." Even a skeptic of the resurrection like Ludemann finds no doubt in the execution itself. John Dominic Crossan, a famously critical scholar, states that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, noting that Josephus and Tacitus confirm it in addition to Christian sources. Bart Ehrman, an atheist historian of early Christianity, likewise asserts, "One of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate." Such statements reflect a broad scholarly consensus. The convergence of the independent sources we've surveyed, the early Christian writings, Roman archives via Tacitus, Jewish history via Josephus and others, leaves virtually no room for reasonable doubt that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. Indeed, the crucifixion is often deemed the starting point for any historical inquiry into Jesus' life, since it is so well attested. As the distinguished scholar E.P. Sanders listed among the almost indisputable facts about Jesus, Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem by the Roman authorities. That said, historians and critical scholars do debate various details of the crucifixion narratives and its surrounding events. While the fact of the crucifixion is solid, the precise circumstances and interpretations have been scrutinized. Scholars largely agree that the charge that led to Jesus' execution was related to treason against Rome. Effectively, that Jesus was claimed to be king of the Jews, posing a potential challenge to Roman rule. The Gospels present a mix of Jewish and Roman reasons: a Jewish trial for blasphemy, followed by Roman concern about a rival king. Historically, Pilate would not execute someone for a purely religious offense like blasphemy. He would, however, crucify a man presented as a seditious claimant to kingship. Thus, many scholars conclude that after Jesus caused a disturbance in Jerusalem, for example the temple incident, the Jewish authorities handed him over as a rebel leader type, leading Pilate to condemn him as titulus on the cross indicated, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This is seen as very plausible historically. There is debate, however, on the role of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Some historians argue the Gospel writers may have amplified the Jewish leaders' involvement and downplayed Pilate's agency to avoid antagonizing Roman leaders. Critical scholarship often notes that Pilate was known to be brutal and unlikely to hesitate at executing a troublemaker. So who exactly wanted Jesus dead, and why is a point of discussion? Was Jesus mainly executed for claiming to be a king, treason, for threatening the temple, a disruptive prophet, or for some form of blasphemy? Different scholars place different weight on these factors, but all within the framework that the end result was crucifixion by Rome. The mainstream view holds that Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God and his activity in Jerusalem were perceived as dangerously messianic, leading to his death. The Gospels differ slightly on whether Jesus died on the Passover feast. Matthew, Mark, and Luke suggest the Last Supper was a Passover meal with the crucifixion the next day, or on the eve of Passover, as John's Gospel places the crucifixion at the time the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. Scholars debate which timeline is historically accurate. Some favor John's chronology, arguing it's more coherent that the Jewish authorities would want Jesus executed before the feast began, while others stick to the synoptic timeline. Astronomy and calendrical studies have been used to propose specific dates like April 7th, 30 CE or April 3rd, 33 CE, but there's no consensus on the exact day. What is agreed upon is the general time frame during a Passover festival in the prefecture of Pilate between 26 and 36 CE, likely around 30 CE. Minor timeline discrepancies are seen as the result of theological emphases rather than fundamental historical error. While the general method is clear, nailing or binding to a cross, details like the shape of the cross and how the nails were placed are debated. The New Testament doesn't describe this explicitly, and archaeological finds show various techniques, such as nails through heels, possibly through wrists or forearms. It's sometimes discussed whether Jesus carried the entire cross or just the crossbeam, the patibulum. The synoptics say Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the cross for Jesus, partway, implying Jesus began the journey carrying it. Historically, victims often carried the crossbeam to the execution site where a permanent stake could be fixed in the ground. It's likely Jesus was nailed through the wrists rather than the palms and feet, as medical analysis suggests nails in the hands alone wouldn't support a body's weight. These are technical debates informed by both archaeology and forensic study of crucifixion. The exact configuration of Jesus' cross, whether a Latin plus shape or T shape, is uncertain but not critical to the core fact of the execution. The Gospels describe dramatic events at the moment of Jesus' death: darkness over the land, an earthquake, and the temple veil torn in two, as mentioned in Matthew 27 verses 45 and 51. Scholars generally consider these theological or symbolic additions rather than historical reportage. Ancient writers often recorded prodigies or omens accompanying great events. For example, Plutarch notes eclipses at Caesar's death. In the case of Jesus, the darkness at noon could have been a solar eclipse metaphor, though Passover occurs at full moon when solar eclipses don't happen, indicating it's not a literal chronology. Historians do not rely on these reported miracles as evidence. Instead, they focus on the underlying event, Jesus' death. The consensus is that such details are not corroborated by any external source, like Roman records of an eclipse then, for instance, and likely serve to underscore the theological significance of Jesus' death, such as cosmic mourning or judgment. Thus, while the crucifixion itself is historical, the miraculous signs at the crucifixion are viewed with skepticism in critical scholarship. Closely tied to the crucifixion is the question of Jesus' burial. The Gospels uniformly say a Jewish council member, Joseph of Arimathea, took Jesus' body and laid it in a tomb. Some scholars, like John Dominic Crossan, have challenged this, suggesting that victims of crucifixion often were left unburied